Well, it's another exciting episode of the JoshCast podcast. I already don't like this. I already don't like this podcast. I'm not feeling it. I am not liking it at all. I'm not liking the, anything about it. I haven't even started yet, and already it's just, I have a negative attitude about it. That's where we're at. And people have said to me, Josh, why don't you do this podcast with someone else? Which is code for, hey, why don't you do it with someone funnier and or more interesting? Maybe that's not what they mean. I don't know. Maybe they think that if I do it alone, I'm way too interesting, way too funny, and it's just too much for the audience. It's too much. So I better find someone to come and just pull me back down to earth amongst you mortals. Because God forbid I do the podcast myself and just blow you away with my geniusness. Geniusness, by the way, probably not a word. Probably not a word. I've said this before on previous podcasts, and I'll say it again. My goal with this podcast is to become rich and famous. And I know that's the wrong reason to do a podcast. It is. And I for years have been telling myself, Josh, every time you try to do something for an ulterior motive, it just totally blows up in your face. And so I'm saying to myself, well, maybe if I just do what I love, just do what I'm passionate about, and the money will follow. Just do what I am passionate about, and the money will follow. Well, I'm not passionate enough or something, but the money just not following so much. And then the thought occurred to me, what if I just go into the greed? Just dive headlong into the greed and just come out and say, listen, I am doing this podcast for an ulterior motive. I want to make money from this podcast. I see all these other comedians who have podcasts and they have advertisers and people are really excited about it and they are making money from the podcast and I want in on it. I want a piece. I want a chunk. I don't even know if I should call myself a comedian. I mean, I work at a comedy club and I do stand-up comedy, but I'm not paid to be a comedian. So if a janitor who's working at a hospital happens to give good medical advice from time to time, still not a doctor. But then again, the problem with that metaphor is that would assume that for someone to be a comedian, an official comedian, they'd have to get a degree, and you don't have to do that. But I guess I don't feel like I consider myself a comedian until I am making a living as a comedian. Until then, I don't feel right calling myself a comedian. I send emails. I'm an emailer. That's what I do. That's what I'm getting paid to do. I send emails. And receive them on occasion. So good. So I think we've established with this podcast, what have we covered here? That I want to make money from it. I don't want to help people with it. I don't want to change the world. I don't want to make the world a better place with this podcast. I'd like to make it a little bit worse, frankly. I'm tired of all these other people making the world worse, and I'm jealous. I want in on it. I want this podcast to. You know what? I suffer from depression. I suffer from anxiety, and I want people listening to this podcast who are not depressed or anxious to get a little depressed or anxious. I want to bring you down to my level. That's what I want, because it's the only way I'm going to feel better. People saying, "Oh yeah, Tim, you know what he does? He just tears people down to make himself feel better." Well, that's brilliant. Good for Tim. Tim's a survivor. There is no actual Tim who's like that. This is an imaginary Tim. Probably didn't have to say that. Well, I don't know. Here's the other thing. I don't want the podcast to be an hour because I can't stand myself for that long. Kidding me? I can stand myself for, I want to say 5-10 minutes tops, and then I need a break. And so you can imagine how how frustrating it is to have never had a break in 36 years. I can only bear about 5 minutes. I'm amazed that I've survived this long. Good. All right. So we've covered that. I hate this podcast. I hate myself. That was implied, I think. I never said that until now, but I think that was implied. And that I want to make money from this podcast that I hate. So I know that's paradoxical. So I guess I'll close by saying if you want to buy advertising space on my podcast, shoot me an email. That's what I do for a living. All right. Well, join me the next time I do this podcast. And, we'll talk about what we talk about. Let's keep it loose. I thought, should the podcast have a theme? The theme is money. That's the theme. Capitalism. Pure Ayn Rand capitalism. That is the theme of this podcast. Thank you very much.